Andy sat at his desk, staring at the message and photo on his laptop. It was her. Someone he had once been close to, someone struggling in silence while he had looked away. The memory rushed back in fragments. Her pleading eyes, the weight of her suffering and his own hesitation. He had buried it all, convinced it was safe to forget. The guilt pressed against him now, heavier than he remembered. His chest tightened. The room felt wrong. The shadows stretched slightly too long. The edges of the walls softened. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake the unease. The photo in his hand felt warmer, almost pulling him forward. A faint dragging sound echoed behind him, soft and uneven. He turned. Nothing. The air felt thicker, heavier, as though the world itself was calling him somewhere else. Before he could understand it, the boundaries of the room began to dissolve. The desk, the walls, the floor softened into shapes that were familiar and wrong. Andy felt his legs lighten, a subtle pull through his body, as if something was drawing him out of the waking world. The memory, the guilt, and the pull merged into one. He exhaled sharply and slipped into the dream. Andy opened his eyes into a space that felt familiar, yet subtly off. The shadows were sharper, the air heavier, quieter. The memory behind him still lingered, but the world in front of him was calm, waiting. He flexed his fingers and lifted his hands, noticing their movements were lighter than normal, almost effortless. The ground beneath his feet shifted slightly, responding to him as if it existed because he willed it. Curious, Andy focused on a wall. He imagined it shifting, folding in on itself. At first, nothing happened, but then the surface wavered, bending just enough to remind him that this space responded to him. A thrill ran through him. He raised his hands again, concentrating on the ceiling. Slowly, it darkened like a sky he could paint. He let go, and it stayed. Step by step, Andy tested the limits. He moved across the room, and the environment adjusted. Not perfectly, not instantly, but enough. A quiet smile crossed his face. The weight of the memory behind him pressed less sharply. The world in front of him was calm, controlled, and entirely his own. He exhaled slowly. I'm in control. Andy moved through the space, testing its edges, stretching the walls, shaping the ground beneath his feet. Everything obeyed him, bending, shifting, responding, just as it had since he entered. He felt a quiet satisfaction, a fragile confidence. Then he noticed it. At first, he thought it was a trick of his eyes, a shadow on the floor that hadn't been there before. But it moved slowly, deliberately, scraping across the surface with faint, rhythmic drag. Andy froze. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but it carried weight. He glanced around. The rest of the space remained calm, responsive. Everything else obeyed him, but this didn't. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on changing the walls, adjusting the ceiling, testing his control as before. The environment still shifted, but the drag persisted, following him wherever he went. A low, steady reminder of something heavier than the dream. Andy exhaled, uneasy but determined. He flexed his hands, concentrated harder, and forced the floor to open up ahead. The walls bent smoothly. Everything responded, yet the dragging sound continued. The weight lingered at the edge of perception, tethered to him like an invisible chain. He took a few more steps, faster this time, forcing the dream to comply. The space adjusted, but the weight didn't relent. Andy realized with a flicker of unease that no matter how much he controlled the dream, the anchor remained. For the first time, he felt that subtle resistance not as a challenge to his power, but as a presence he couldn't dismiss. A tether, a reminder. Andy tried one last test. He focused on the object itself, willing it to disappear. The space obeyed, everything shifted, but the anchor stayed. Heavy, silent, waiting. He let out a slow breath. Not going away, huh? The calm certainty he had felt moments ago now wavered. Control had a limit, and the anchor was proof. Andy kept moving, stretching the dream ahead of him, reshaping the walls, forming doors and pathways. The environment still responded, bending and folding under his will. For a moment, it felt like he was in control again, but the drag never left. He could feel it faintly behind him, a constant weight, tethered, unyielding. He refused to look back. If he ignored it, maybe it would vanish. Step by step, He forced the dream to obey. A corridor extended before him, open and smooth. The ceiling darkened at his thought. Shadows moved, but only where he willed them. Everything followed except the weight. Then came the stalker, not fully formed, not obvious, a blur at the edge of his vision, half seen in the flicker of the dream. He caught glimpses of it in reflective surfaces, in the corners of the corridors he created, always behind, always observing. Nothing threatening, yet undeniably present. Andy clenched his jaw, focusing harder on reshaping the space ahead. The stalker didn't respond to him directly. It never approached, never attacked, but it was there, constant. Like the anchor, it was tethered to the memory he had buried. He exhaled slowly, refusing to look back, not paying attention. Doesn't exist, he muttered under his breath. He moved faster, pushing the dream forward. The walls stretched, doors opened, the ceiling shifted again. Every small act of creation was a distraction, a test of his control. But the stalker and the drag persisted, subtle, patient, following him, waiting for him to falter. Andy's confidence wavered slightly, but he forced himself onward. Just keep moving. Step after step, he avoided it, ignored it. Pretended control was enough. For now, Andy's steps slowed. No matter how fast he moved, the drag behind him seemed to grow heavier, pressing against him in ways he couldn't ignore. The space that had once obeyed him without question now resisted. Walls bent reluctantly. The floor rippled slightly under his weight, and shapes flickered at the edges of his vision. He lifted his hands, trying to reshape the ceiling, the corridor, the doors he had created. It responded, but sluggishly, unevenly. The air felt thicker, the quiet less pure. Every change required more effort, as if the dream itself had grown weary of obeying him. The stalker appeared again, half seen in the shadows of a warped corridor. Andy caught its blurred outline in his peripheral vision, a reminder that he wasn't alone. It didn't move toward him, didn't attack, but the presence pressed against him, insistent, tethered to the weight dragging behind him. Andy exhaled, jaw tight. He focused harder, forcing the space to respond, stretching the corridor ahead like he had before. It bent and shifted, but the edges wavered, incomplete, flickering like something unstable. The floor beneath him seemed to pull back slightly, resisting each step, dragging the anchor with it, reminding him of its weight. He could feel it now, not just in the dream, but in himself. A pressure in his chest, a tension in his stomach. Each attempt to avoid, to manipulate, to control, only made it heavier. Andy stopped for a moment, staring at the corridor ahead. He tried to push the thought away, to focus on the familiar calm he had felt before. But the resistance, the flickers, the subtle presence behind him, they were all there, patient, unyielding. He swallowed, taking a slow breath. "It's still here," he muttered. And with that realization, the dream seemed to thrum slightly beneath his feet, unstable and shifting. The weight wasn't just behind him anymore. It was everywhere, pressing in from all directions, demanding attention. The corridor ahead warped under Andy's gaze. Shapes that hadn't existed before flickered into view. Walls bending strangely. Shadows stretching too long. Surfaces shimmering as if they weren't solid. He reached out, trying to reshape them, but the space resisted. His control, once absolute, wavered. And then he saw it. A doorway where none had been. Beyond it, vague shapes coalesced. A room, dimly lit, familiar yet wrong. He squinted. A figure stood there, blurred, edges flickering like a broken reflection. He didn't need to look closer to know who it was. The presence carried the same weight as the memory he had buried, the suffering he had ignored. Andy shook his head, trying to force the walls to smooth, the shadows to recede. But the space no longer obeyed fully. The corridor twisted in on itself, stretching and folding without regard for his intent. Even small steps felt heavy, as if he were wading through water. The stalker appeared again, closer this time, lingering in the distorted shapes. Its outline merged with fragments of the environment. A flickering wall became an arm. A shadowed corner hinted at a face. Andy's stomach tightened. The anchor pulled harder. He felt it in his chest now, in his limbs, a subtle ache he couldn't shake. The dream was no longer a playground. It was a mirror, bending and breaking to show him what it tried to hide. Andy stumbled slightly, reaching out to touch the flickering figure beyond the doorway. The hand didn't feel solid. It dissolved into light, and yet the recognition hit him. He had been here before. He had seen it, and he had turned away. The environment trembled subtly, fragments of rooms, faces, and places blending together, resisting his control. The guilt he had buried so carefully was rising, manifesting as distortions in the dream itself. Andy's breath quickened. I didn't want to see this. But there was no turning back. The dream would not let him. Andy gritted his teeth and clenched his fists. He focused on the walls, the corridor, the shifting floor. Anything he could bend, reshape, control. He willed the flickering shapes to obey, to solidify, to return to the calm order he had felt when he first entered. At first, the environment trembled, edges aligned for a heartbeat, shadows straightened. The floor felt slightly firmer, but it was fleeting. The distorted shape snapped back, bending and twisting with persistence he couldn't fight. He stepped forward faster, stretching his hands toward the ceiling, willing the space to yield. The stalker appeared again, closer, its form sharper now, merging with fragments of the environment. The doorway, the blurred figure, a shadow on the wall. He tried to push it away, to force the dream back to his control. Nothing worked. The anchor pulled harder than ever. The floor beneath him seemed to resist every step, every motion. The air thickened. The pressure in his chest, in his stomach, his limbs became impossible to ignore. The dream was no longer a reflection of his will. It had become a reflection of his inaction. Andy's jaw tightened, and he tried one last, desperate push to shape the space entirely, to erase the weight, to run from the fragments of memory he had buried. The walls bent violently under his will. The floor twisted beneath him. The ceiling shuddered, but the stalker remained. The doorway flickered. The figure blurred. The anchor stayed tethered, dragging relentlessly. He stopped. He let out a long, shaky breath. For the first time, Andy realized he could not escape. Not the dream, not the weight, not the memory. The control he had relied on was gone. The calm certainty he had felt at the start of the dream had collapsed. All that remained was the quiet, relentless presence of what he'd ignored. Andy's hands fell to his sides. His chest rose and fell sharply. He looked around the distorted space, finally seeing it for what it was, a mirror of his own guilt, inescapable and patient. He exhaled slowly, and for the first time he stopped fighting. Andy's feet stopped moving. The frantic pace, the attempts to reshape, the stretching corridors, all of it ended. He turned slowly, facing the space behind him. The stalker hovered there, partially formed, a blurred silhouette against the flickering walls. The anchor rested on the floor, tethered to him still, heavy and unyielding. He expected fear, hesitation, panic, but there was none, only presence. Andy took a tentative step forward. The stalker didn't advance. It didn't shift or threaten. It simply existed, quietly, tethered to the anchor that dragged silently across the warped floor. The distortions of the dream seemed to pause around it, waiting. He looked at the fragments now scattered in the corridors and rooms. The flickering shapes of the doorway, the blurred figure, the shadowed edges of space. Each one pulsed faintly, a memory embedded in the dream itself. The environment wasn't reacting to him anymore. It was tied to what he had done, or more precisely, what he had failed to do. And he exhaled slowly, his chest tight. He realized the stalker and the anchor were not enemies. They were guides, holding up the parts of the memory he had buried, showing him what he had avoided for so long. He stepped closer to the anchor. It didn't move. It was heavy, yes, but inert. The weight wasn't meant to trap him. It was meant to connect him, to force him to face the truth he had pushed down. The stalker shifted slightly, not toward him, but in a gesture that revealed the doorway again, the blurred figure within it. The person he had ignored was now clearer, just enough for Andy to recognize the face he had avoided. For the first time, he looked directly at it. He no longer tried to reshape the dream. He no longer ran. The space had become exactly what it needed to be. A mirror of the memory he had buried, a reflection of his silence, his inaction. Andy's voice was barely audible. I see it. And in that acknowledgement, the confrontation wasn't a battle. It was recognition. The doorway flickered. then solidified. The blurred figure sharpened into clarity. Andy saw her, her face pale, eyes wide, desperate. She was trapped, cornered in a space that was both familiar and impossible, the weight of her suffering pressing down around her. Andy's stomach knotted. He remembered every detail. The day she had struggled, reaching out silently for help, the pleading look she had given him, the small, almost imperceptible signs he had chosen to ignore, the moments he had turned away, distracted, afraid, or simply unwilling to intervene. The memory hit him fully, unrelenting. He saw himself then younger, hesitant, looking at her and stepping back, pretending nothing was wrong, pretending it wasn't his responsibility, pretending he didn't see. He felt the weight now, not as a shadow in the dream, but deep in his chest. The anchor tugged harder, pressing against him, not punishing, but insisting he remember. The stalker hovered nearby, motionless, holding the space that reflected his silence. Andy's throat tightened. The guilt, the regret, the quiet betrayal he had buried for so long, it surged through him in a tidal wave of recognition. He had failed her. He had ignored her suffering. He had chosen comfort over action, and now the dream would not let him forget. He whispered her name, though no sound came. I remember the fragmented rooms, the distorted corridors, the pulsing shadows. They all aligned now, forming a single, coherent reflection of that moment he had repressed. The dream was no longer about control or escape or manipulation. It was about acknowledgement. Andy faced it fully. The memory, once buried, now demanded recognition, and he could no longer look away. Andy stepped back from the doorway, his gaze lingering on her face one last time. The memory had been laid bare, every detail sharp and unflinching. He could feel the weight in his chest, the anchor still tethered to him, dragging gently across the floor. It wasn't punishing him. It was reminding him. He knew he could not change the past. There was no undoing, no fixing what he had ignored. All he could do was carry it, acknowledge it, and let it settle inside him. The dream began to calm. The flickering walls softened, the distorted corridors eased, and the chaotic shadows retreated slightly. Yet the anchor remained. It rested at his side, a quiet presence, a tether to the truth he could no longer avoid. And he exhaled slowly, the tension in his limbs easing only partially. He had control of the dream world, but it no longer mattered in the same way. The real weight was inside him now, internalized, a silent pulse he could feel with every breath. He walked slowly through the stabilized corridors, each step deliberate. The stalker lingered behind, stationary, a witness rather than a threat. Andy didn't turn to run. He didn't try to escape. He stopped in the center of the space, looking around at the room that was once his own creation, now transformed into a reflection of a memory he could no longer bury. Quietly, he whispered to himself, I can't forget this. The dream held him steady, patient, unyielding. And for the first time, Andy understood some truths could never be escaped. He closed his eyes. The room stayed still. The anchor stayed tethered. And Andy, finally aware, finally guilty, remained with it.